Hi, how's it going? Zach D Productions here, and I am here for a ranking video for you guys. So for this ranking, I'll be ranking the studio albums from Metal Legends Sepultura. Now, you could pretty much call these guys a thrash metal band. I think most people would agree that they are thrash metal. I mean, if you were to classify them in a metal subgenre, I would say that they fall under the thrash metal genre. And I would say that they are one of the most unique bands in the genre, and they definitely stand out on their own, I think. Definitely a great band. Of course, you had Max Cavalera in the first few albums, and then he went and did his own thing and did other projects, and of course he moved on to Soulfly, and then they got a new vocalist who I think is also really good. I mean, they didn't really have a misstep or anything, because I know in a lot of cases when bands get a new singer or a new vocalist, sometimes it's a change for the worst, and I wouldn't necessarily say that in this case. I mean, I would say that the Max Cavalera stuff is the best. I mean, you'll see where all these albums are ranked, of course, but, you know, I wouldn't really consider the modern era of Sepultura bad by any means. It's still pretty solid music for sure. Now, I know which ones I would place at the bottom. I do know which ones I think are their worst. But even though I think that the ones that are last are their worst, I wouldn't really call them hot garbage or anything. Like, I wouldn't say that they're unlistenable or anything. I'd say that their worst album is just okay at best. I mean, yeah, they really didn't have an album that I thought was like so bad that it was just unlistenable or it's just plain garbage or whatever. Not necessarily, but yeah, so let's go ahead and get started with this ranking. We'll be going from worst to best, my least favorite to favorite, of course, so let's go ahead and get started. So when I have last, I gotta go with Against. And this album here, they kind of experiment with that whole tribal thing in this album. I mean, they've done that with the album that came before this, but you know, this was, of course, back when nu metal was at its peak. You know, they were pretty much seeing what was going on in nu metal, and a lot of that definitely played a factor in this album. But, yeah, this album here, it just lacks replay value. I mean, musicianship is all right. You know, again, I wouldn't really say that their worst album is garbage. It's just okay, in my opinion. But, yeah, it's just... it doesn't really work for them. So, Against. Okay, so next we got Nation, which is a step up from Against for sure. You know, pretty good stuff on here. You know, not some of their best work, of course, but I think this album for me is just a little forgettable. That's really my biggest problem with this album. But still, I think it's at least a step up from Nation, you know. I mean, there is some good stuff in the first half. Now, the second half, not that strong, but, I mean, the first half of this album has some pretty good tracks, but, you know, nothing really stands out. But still, you know, it's all right. It's an all right album. So next we got A-Lex, which is somewhat of an experimental album. You know, it sounds more robotic, if that makes sense. I mean, this album, it's just, the experimentation, I mean, I appreciate what they're doing here, and I think, you know, on some songs, you know, it works for them, but the album as a whole, it just lacks replay value. It just is not that memorable. And there's just other stuff from Sepultura I'd rather listen to be honest. But, yeah. Again, there are some good tracks on this album, but, again, the biggest flaw of this album is, I think, the production and also the fact that it is kind of forgettable. But, yeah, A-Lex, it's, again, an okay album. Now, this next album here, I can definitely see a lot of people disagreeing with this one. Some people might place this in the top 5 or maybe even top 3, but who knows. But next I gotta go with Roots. And I do think that this is a good album. I think from this point on in the ranking, we're getting into the good stuff from Sepultura. Everything before I thought was just okay. Now we're getting into the good material, I'd say, like the very good material. Even in saying that, I still think that this album is pretty good. It's a pretty good album. With this album here, they were definitely experimenting with some nu metal elements. Again, this was around the time when nu metal was at its peak, you could say. And I think if you are into nu metal and maybe want to look into Sepultura, I would say that this is the album to check out, because this is as nu metal as Sepultura is going to get. But yeah, there is some good songs on the album. I mean, now the second half of this album I could really live without, but the first half does have some very good tracks. I mean, of course you have the iconic Roots Bloody Roots, which is a classic. It's very memorable, and you have Attitude, which I also really like as well. But yeah, this was also the last Sepultura album with Max Cavalera in the band. But yeah, I mean, it's a good album, but just overall not one of my personal favorites. Again, it is more nu metal, and, you know, the reason that I have their more nu metal stuff closer to the bottom is not that I have necessarily anything against nu metal. It's just nu metal doesn't work with Sepultura, in my opinion. But I think when it comes to Sepultura doing nu metal stuff, I think that this is probably the closest to them getting it right, I think. But even in saying that, it just doesn't work for them, because even, again, there's still some songs, a number of songs on this album that I could live without, you know. I would just prefer Sepultura to do their own thing. Let them be Sepultura, and, you know, let Korn be Korn, basically, you know. You don't need to, you know, take ideas from Korn. Now, I know a lot of metal bands were, but, you know, it's kind of obvious here. But still, pretty good album. So next we have Roorback. And pretty good album. I mean, it's not one of their best, once again, but still, I think it's a pretty good album for what it is. I do like some of the songs on here, like Come Back Alive and Corrupted. I think those are some of the best tracks on the album. But like with some of the others I've mentioned, one of the biggest flaws with this album is there's a few tracks that are rather skippable and forgettable as well. Not that I would consider anything on this album bad, it's just, again, there's other stuff from Sepultura that I think is better and I would rather listen to. But, you know, this album, it does sound of its time. You know, I don't really have a problem with the production of this album or anything. It's just, in my opinion, not one of their strongest, but still pretty good. Pretty good for what it is. Okay, so next we have Dante, which I do think this album is kind of underrated, actually. And in my opinion, it is probably the best of their 2000s work. Convicted in Life is probably my favorite song on this album. I actually really dig this song a lot. I dig the riff work and the drum work and everything it has going for it. Just the heaviness and the aggression of this song, really good. And you also have Dark Wood of Error, and you also have Fighting On, and Buried Words. I mean, yeah, lots to like with this album. A lot of good stuff. A lot of good stuff with this album. Again, probably the best of their 2000s work. I dig everything about it, really. It's just raw and heavy, and yeah, definitely worth checking out if you're a Sepultura fan, for whatever reason you have passed this one up. If you have passed this one up, I'd say give it a go. It's actually a really good album. Okay, so next we have the only Sepultura CD that I don't have, and that is Keros. And yeah, I do like this album. It's pretty good. I mean, it's got pretty good production, and, you know, this is, of course, from their more modern era, and I do think that when it comes to, you know, the 2010s era of Sepultura, this is maybe the weakest one, but even in saying that, still pretty good. There's still a lot to like with this album. I still think it's solid. So yeah, but it's got to be somewhere in the ranking, right? So next, I got to go with the Mediator between Head and Hands, Must Be the Heart, which is definitely a step up from Keros, in my opinion. I dig the production on this album, the heaviness, and just the musicianship and everything that it has going for it. Lots to like with this album. Lots of good stuff. And, you know, at this time, Sepultura were really stepping up their game because, You know, in the 2000s and even in the late 90s, Sepultura were kind of not putting out some of their best work. But I think for this time being, I think that this was some of their best work in years. Like, you could say that this era of Sepultura was basically their comeback to just making, well, Sepultura music, you know, doing what they should do, I think, you know? But yeah, really good stuff for sure, really good album. So, the Mediator. So next, this next album here, some people might place higher. I know that there's a lot of love for this album, but for me, it's got a place here in the ranking. But I still think it's a great album. It's really good, and I mean, there's a lot of good stuff going for it. So that album is Machine Messiah, which I know some people claim to be the best of their more recent material, and it's a solid album. It is. I dig the experimentation on this album. You know, when it comes to experimentation in albums, sometimes the concept of that can be very hit or miss. But in this case, it works for them. I dig what they're going for here. You know, they're trying some different stuff here, like with the title track, Machine Messiah, which is more doomy sounding. I really dig it. I do. It is kind of slower, which some people might not like, but I dig it, actually. I think it's a pretty strong track. I mean, I wouldn't call it one of my favorite Sepultura songs or anything, but I dig it, though. I think it's pretty good. And then you, of course, I Am the Enemy, Phantom Self, which has some really great drum work and everything. And yeah, really good stuff. Really good production and everything like that. So Machine Messiah, great album. But next we get into the album which I do think is the best of their most recent work. And that is their latest album, Quadra. Again, I dig the production on this album and everything like that. It's just very solid, and, you know, it seems like ever since Keros, they've been getting better with each release. Like, the Mediator was a step up from Keros. Machine Messiah was a step up from the Mediator, and I think that Quadra is a step up from Machine Messiah. But yeah, really great album for sure. Lots of skilled musicianship, great songwriting and everything. Yeah, really good stuff. And again, I think that this is maybe the best of their more recent stuff, and in my opinion, probably the best thing that Sepultura has done in years. Great album for sure. Okay, so here we are at the top 5, and these are the original albums that feature Max Cavalera, of course. And yeah, I do like Max Cavalera as a vocalist. Just the aggression that he puts into his voice and everything, really good. I dig a lot of his work, so of course, you know, it makes sense to why that, you know, these classics are going to make my top 5. But how would I rank my top 5? Well, let's get into it. So at number 5, I gotta go with Schizophrenia, which is their second album, and it's definitely a classic. I mean, there's a lot of really great stuff on this album, especially in the first half of this album. You got From the Past Comes the Storms, To the Wall, and Escape to the Void. Really great songs for sure. Yeah, lots of rawness. You know, the production is raw. It's just really aggressive and brutal, heavy, really good sounding metal stuff. So there you go, Schizophrenia. And at number 4, I gotta go with their debut album, Morbid Visions. I mean, I really like this album a lot. I mean, this is easily one of their best in my opinion. The first few tracks, again, just excellent. I love the first half. I mean, you got Morbid Visions, Mayhem, and Troops of Doom, which is just epic. I mean, this album here, I'd say if you're someone who loves death metal, I would say give this album a go if you're not familiar with Sepultura or much thrash, because I know that there's a lot of, you know, metal elitists out there who say, well, it's only the, you know, genres in death and black metal that matter, basically. But I think a lot of those fans would really dig this album, because this album, you know, this was like pre-death metal, you could say. But yeah, very raw, aggressive sounding stuff. So great album, really good one for sure. Now for my top three, I mean, my top three was kind of easy, although when it comes to my top two, it's kind of tough deciding between the two because they're both classics and great albums for sure. But at number three, I got to go with Chaos AD. Some people might place it number one, and that's okay. For me, it's only at number three, but it's an awesome album. It still is. These top three albums are just spectacular. I mean, you got Refuse Resist, you got Territory, Slave New World. I mean, this was kind of the album where Sepultura, you can kind of tell that they're straying away from, you know, what they were doing before, and then they started to see what nu metal was all about, and then started taking a little bit of inspiration. I wouldn't really call this a nu metal album. It's not as nu metal as Roots or Against or anything, but you know, you can tell with this album they're kind of leaning towards that direction. But you know, I think this album was done very well. It's, you know, well produced and everything. It's just, you know, I really can't complain about it. It's great. It's definitely a great album, easily one of their best. And then at number two, I gotta go with Beneath the Remains, which for the longest time has been my number one, but it's kind of went down to number two. But still, great album, definitely a classic for sure. Of course, you can't go wrong with pretty much anything on this album. I mean, you got Beneath the Remains, Inner Self, Stronger Than Hate, Slaves of Pain. I mean, just really strong material that's really aggressive, heavy, and yeah, very raw sounding. And this was actually the album that helped me get into Sepultura. This was basically my first Sepultura album. I know that this was the first one I ever checked out and things like that. And yeah, this is a great introduction if you're looking to check out Sepultura for sure. I'd say that it's a must listen for sure. So Beneath the Remains, definitely a great album, one of their best. But at number one, I mean, this album, it's amazing how much this album has really grown on me and grown to be my number one. And that album is Arise. And I think almost every Sepultura fan can at least agree that this is, if it's not at least number one, it's definitely one of their best. But for me, it is number one. I mean, you got Dead Embryonic Cells. And you got Desperate Cry, which I really dig a lot. I mean, lots of good stuff. Lots of good stuff on this album for sure. I really can't complain about any of the songs. I wouldn't really say that there's a skippable track on this album. I think it's a very strong album front to back. It's just really good. It's just that good of an album. And yeah, it's one of the Sepultura albums that I reach for the most. And it's just a great album. Great album overall. So yeah, Arise, great album. So there you have it. That is my ranking for the Sepultura discography. I just went over the main studio albums. Let me know what you think. Are you a Sepultura fan? How would you rank their albums? Feel free to let me know. So on that note, thanks for watching and have a good one.